I wanted to welcome you once again to another episode of Axis of Resistance Initiative at the GNSI. This is our last panel, and as we promised, this panel will be on Yemen. We are recording this panel on September 22nd, and we are here having our pleasure to have three esteemed guests. I'm here having Mrs. Nadwa Al-Dawsari, an associate fellow at the Middle East Institute and fellow at the Center on Armed Groups. Nadwa is a researcher whose research focuses largely on conflict in Yemen. In her previous roles, she served as a senior conflict advisor to the World Forum Program, a Yemen country director at the Center for Civilian in Conflict, the funding director at the Partners Yemen, a MENAP advisor at the Partners Global, and a senior program manager at the National Democratic Institute. She has provided advisory services to policymakers from the United States and Europeans, UN agencies, and humanitarian organizations. Nadwa is regularly featured as a guest speaker on panel discussions about Yemen and the broader Middle East, and her work has been widely published by the top think tanks in the United States and Europe. Our second panel is the Dr. John Pennell. Dr. Pennell is a former U.S. Senior Foreign Service Officer with more than 20 years of experiences of the executive level, leading multidisciplinary interagency and joint teams to oversee foreign assistance, security cooperation programs across Africa, Eurasia, and Indo-Pacific, Latin America, and the Middle East. He has a PhD in War and Defense Studies from King's College of London, a master's degree from the National War College and American University. In 2024, he published a book on Russia's irregular warfare activities in Syria and Ukraine, named Assessing Russian Actions in Ukraine and Syria, 2014 to 2022, Implications for the Changing Character of the War. Dr. Pennell has published in peer-reviewed journals in international security and foreign affairs space. Per her request, which is also applicable to all other guests, Dr. Pennell's and other guests' statements and comments here is not reflecting any institution or agency's point of view. It is their own views, and they are making it at their own risk. Our last panelist is Mr. Alex Vatankhab, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. He is a specialist in Middle Eastern regional security affairs with particular focus on Iran. He was formerly a senior analyst at the Janes Information Group in London. Alex is also a senior fellow in the Middle East Studies at the U.S. Air Force Special Operations School at the Halbert Field and teaches as an adjunct professor at DISA at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He has testified before the United States Congress and lectured widely for both governmental and commercial audiences, including the U.S. Department of the State and Defense, U.S. intelligence agencies, and the list of the international collaboration. Mr. Vatankhab is the author of two books so far: The Battle of Ayatollahs in Iran, the United States, Foreign Policy and Political Rivalry since the 1979. This book was published in 2021, and his previous book was Iran and the Pakistan, Security, Diplomacy, and American Influence, which was published in 2015. Once again, all of our dear guests, welcome and thank you for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have you. It's a great pleasure for me and the GNSI. I would like to start this conversation per our previous arrangement on the past. And, we start from the past and then we go to the future toward them. And Nadwa, if it is fine, I would like to ask you the first question. Today, the name of the Houthis is, I think it's kind of worldly now, at least if you are remotely interested in the Middle East, you have heard about them. But they are not a new element. They actually been there quite a lot. Now they are capturing the headlines. That's what we are hearing. But I want to ask you, as an expert of the matter, that if it is possible, give us a background on the Houthis, how their movement began, who supported them began, and what was their initial goals from the very beginning.
Right, thank you. So the Houthis are some of the most misread organizations. So the group has been in Yemen for decades. It actually comes from the Jarudi school, which is a radical offshoot of Zaydi Shia Islam. Jarudis believe that political authority rests exclusively with al-Bayt, which is a term that refers to the people of Prophet Muhammad or descendants of Prophet Muhammad or his bloodline. and that rulers have ultimate and unquestionable authority over their subjects. The group emerged in the 1990s, but also historically, they are an extension of the Zaydi Imamate in Yemen, a theocracy that ruled the country or parts of the country for hundreds of years over a 1,000-year stretch. More recently, between 2018 until it was, and between 1918 until it was overthrown in 1962. They're also inspired by the Iranian Revolution, in particular, the concept of Wilayat al-Faqih, where a figure or a supreme leader has the ultimate political and religious authority. So this blend of Yemen's Imamate legacy and Iran's revolutionary model is what gives the Houthis both their historical roots, but also their modern day ideological framework, which drives their actions.
Thank you, Nadwa. But I have one quick follow-up question before going forward, because you mentioned being inspired by the Iranians. I wonder that the movement from the beginning was, in your view, a purely Yemenis movement, or from the very beginning, Houthis had a greater, inspiration. Did they ever, at any point, at the very beginning, had an idea or thoughts about, about the Shia part of the Saudi Arabia, or was it a pure local movement, or it had some regional ambitions? Which one was the case?
The Houthis was a local movement back in the 80s and the 90s. It was a local movement. The aspiration was to bring some balance to power, where descendants of Prophet Muhammad have more influence. When I talked about the Imamate, the Imams who ruled Yemen until 1962 were Hashemites, were descendants of Prophet Muhammad, and that's how they claimed legitimacy. And so when the Imamate were overthrown, there were Zaydi scholars who remained sort of committed to that model of governance, and the Houthis emerged from that. Wow. And so they were local. They wanted to rule Yemen as imams, as sort of modern day imams, as descendants of Prophet Muhammad, sort of reinstate the Imamate or a version of it. But it was the Iranian connection and Iran's support that sort of transformed the Houthis from this local organization with a local mandate into a global transnational movement, or a regional transnational movement with a global agenda, in my opinion.
Thank you, Nadwa. And I appreciate, you mentioning the role of the past and restating what they had in the past, which, John, brings me to my question for you. I mean, speaking of the past, United States' interest, and I'm sure that you can outline it even better than me, in Yemen is not a new thing. It's been there. United States has been interested in Yemen since the Cold War age and even earlier on. If I want to ask you a question, and I ask you to what's the general core, or what's the general U.S. in the interest in a Yemen throughout the history, at least what brought the United States primarily to the Yemen, what United States at the beginning cared about the Yemen before, the issue of the counterterrorism. What would be your answer?
Certainly. Well, thanks again for having me on this very esteemed panel to discuss a very, very important issue. So going back historically, particularly back to the Cold War era, when the U.S. and its allies were very much focused on containing the Soviet Union, the Middle East as a whole, but including Yemen as well, were seen very much through the Soviet Cold War containment lens, if you will. And the engagement, obviously, with Yemen and other parts of the Middle East was very much focused on more geopolitical issues, given that context. It's also very important to note, within the geopolitical interest side of the equation, that Yemen has a very important strategic location for both maritime security, but also commerce in terms of trade, including energy transit as well. And given that strategic location, I think a lot of powers, if you will, the United States, the Soviet Union, at that time, and others, including more recently, obviously, Iran, have had a lot of interest in Yemen as well. I think as we see the evolution over time, particularly since, the end of the Cold War, so to speak, in the early 90s and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the policies have gradually developed and shifted, although particularly since 2001 and the 9/11 attacks, the focus has been mostly on counterterrorism operations, but still looking at what was happening in the region in terms of also, commerce and energy transit as well. And then certainly since 9/11, focus on security cooperation, and then particularly on countering Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP. But then also with the U.S. being a long-standing partner of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, KSA, also working with the Saudis, and if not even prioritizing their security, on the peninsula itself, and that being very important as well. Related to that, of course, is also ensuring that any choke points that would impact maritime security, particularly related to commerce, energy transit, that those were mitigated, given that cooperation. I think maybe one overarching point to consider, particularly, let's say, since the end of the Cold War, and especially since, let's say, 9/11, I think the U.S. has really looked at the region, and then particularly Yemen and that part of the Middle East, as trying to balance a focus on counterterrorism with regional stability, with addressing humanitarian issues, with swings across these different priorities, if you will, sometimes in a contradictory fashion, if you will, or potentially counterproductive fashion, and kind of swinging between military escalation and diplomatic engagement. And so certainly I'd say leading up to, let's say, 2014 or so, that was kind of the balance. And then obviously even more recently, in the last few years as well, kind of looking at it within that lens, kind of shifting priorities, which sometimes would contradict or counter each other.
Thank you, John. I have a quick question. I mean,
Sure.
We will get to the since 9/11 later on, but I want to ask a questions about what happened after the collapse of Soviet Union. When it comes to the U.S. Middle East policy, there is an argument that some make that during the Cold War, United States Middle East policy was so cemented based on the great power rivalry that once the Soviet Union collapsed, except the issue of the Iranian and the Arab-Israeli conflict, and obviously the alliance with the Saudi Arabia and Arab state of the Persian Gulf, the rest of the Middle East, specifically speaking Yemen, fell out of the attention of the United States, meaning that in the absence of the Soviet Union project for the unification of the Yemen, the United States didn't felt much of a need to develop a Yemen policy. What we would like to ask you that first, do you think it is true? You're the expert. Second, do you think United States at any point prior to the events that now we are witnessing had developed or tried to develop a Yemen policy? And if they did, what was that?
Certainly, a great question. Yeah, I think absolutely. If you look at between, let's say, the 90s and that period leading up to 9/11, in 2001, I think other parts of the Middle East and other issues were certainly prioritized over Yemen, without a doubt. I think countering Iran has always been a priority since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, of course, but then also ensuring that you mentioned the Arab-Israeli conflict, its continuing support to Israel. There were various efforts on Arab-Israeli and Palestine-Israeli peace processes that obviously ebbed and flowed, and we're still dealing with these issues today, unfortunately, over many years. I think the policy really was more about continuing to help its long-standing partners such as KSA, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, obviously Israel, as I mentioned already, and I think maybe deprioritizing other parts of the region. I think as we've seen, obviously since 9/11, a more proactive approach in dealing with some of these things may have had a different outcome, possibly, in terms of the counterterrorism focus. It's a little bit hard to say, but certainly the focus on the Middle East and Yemen in particular really has been going back to the Cold War, as I mentioned, on the great power competition, competition with the Soviet Union at that time for influence in the region. And then certainly, I think fairly consistently countering Iran and Iranian influence in the region and globally. And to the extent that Yemen was a part of that, I think that would have been the focus. Obviously, after 9/11, there was a greater focus on countering al-Qaeda and its affiliates globally. And so at that point in time, there's greater attention to Yemen, particularly with the al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP organization based there, and all the security cooperation with the government of Yemen at the time. And obviously, there were some challenges in some of that relationship and relationship building. And obviously a lot of airstrikes over the years. And I think we all know some civilian casualties as well. And obviously there have been some significant humanitarian challenges and crises in that country for an extremely long period of time, which are still active, unfortunately. So, I guess to kind of sum it all up, going from the lens of great power competition and countering the Soviet Union, but also as part of that, countering Iran and Iranian influence, to essentially focusing more on Yemen after 9/11, and probably not as much in the period of the 90s after the Soviet Union's collapse and the Cold War ended, so to speak.
Thank you, John. And speaking of Iran, I would like to ask Alex. Alex, when the Islamic Revolution Iraq, succeeded in Ayatollah Khomeini came to Iran and established the government. In the beginning of the revolution, despite all of the aspiration for the so-called exporting the revolution, it seemed Iranians' focus were largely on Iraq, given the ties that Ayatollah Khomeini had with the Saad family, and also obviously with the Lebanon, Imam Musa Saad being there, and many of the tier one leader of the revolution, like the Chamran, having involvement there. Yemen never seems to not be as a hot topic for the revolutionaries as the rest, or it might be it's been covered. That's a question for you. However, some reports suggest that at the very beginning of the revolution, there was a meeting between the Ayatollah Khomeini, or at least his Beit, his office, and a representative of the Houthis in Qom. The question that I do have for you, the first question is that, what are the roots of the Iranian connection to the Houthis?
It's great to be with you and with Nadwa and John. Look, I think you will struggle to come up with a definition of the obviously Houthis or the Zaydis of north of Yemen in 1979 that would have made a lot of sense for your average Islamist pro-Khomeini Iranian at the time. As you pointed out, Iran's attention was in the Levant. Many of those Khomeini supporters that had teamed up with members of, say, the likes of PLO and others, Islamists even, they had been comrades in arms in places like the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon, even at short periods of time in Egypt. Not so anywhere in the Arabian Peninsula. So Yemen, to your point, was not on their radars. It's far away from Iran geographically. It's not to say Iran hasn't had an interest in Yemen before 1979. We all know that the Shah of Iran famously sided with the so-called royalists in that country's civil war throughout the 1960s against what Shah feared to be Republican pan-Arab initiatives led by, the Egyptians at the time. Iran, again, we should remember at the time was actually on the side of United States, United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, Israel even. They all fought the left, if you will, that was being promoted or it was seen to be promoted by Nasser of Egypt. So Iran had an interest in Yemen as early as the 60s. But I would say 1979, early on, certainly my reading of it is not a pivotal moment because, again, as you pointed out, Arman, their attention was elsewhere. We all know what happens in the 1980s. Iran is busy fighting Saddam Hussein. It just didn't have the capacity, interest, ideological or material capacity to be a player in whatever is going on in Yemen at the time. At the time of the unification of Yemen, 1990, if you're thinking the Iranians are rushing into Yemen looking for opportunities, they're not. They go to places like Hassan Turabi and Bashir's Sudan, which they find after the coup in Sudan in 1989 to be more fertile ground for pan-Islamism. Yemen is still not a player. I would say Yemen is not even a player till about 2004 or 5. A number of wars are, we know that some of these leadership of the Houthi movement end up in Iran having meetings. There are pictures of it. They're documented. But anybody who says that this was a big item on the agenda of Iran at the time, I think would be exaggerating. What really happens, if again I'm going through the decades here, forgive me for being sort of giving you a big picture, but really what happens, I think, is after Arab Spring and 2014 and 15, with the intervention of Saudi Arabia in the Yemen civil war, that's when Iran really starts to sort of invest in the Houthis in ways we hadn't seen before. I'm not saying there wasn't any investment before then. And Saleh in Yemen for a long time always would, paint his Houthis, Ansar Allah, whatever you want to call them, as pro-Iranian or Iranian-backed. There was an element of truth in that, but Ali Saleh always exaggerated Iran's involvement because, as we just heard, Nadwa, I think, said, it's a local actor with a local agenda. Yes, it's been getting Iranian support, and in recent years from the Chinese, the Russians, probably others, and Iran's one of those foreign sponsors. But I would be careful not to exaggerate it, and I wouldn't point to 1979 as the moment Iran sort of comes in and looks to the Zaydis of northern Yemen as a partner. It comes much later, and it comes as a result of geopolitical kind of competition that's happening in the Middle East, particularly between Iran, Saudis, and the Emiratis. And I would just stop here by saying the idea for me that the Houthis are Hezbollah of Lebanon for Iran in southern Arabian Peninsula has always been not backed by evidence, if I could put it to you that way.
So I appreciate. I think we will get back to the Hezbollah, Houthis being the Hezbollah or not being a little bit later on. But I have a quick follow-up question. So from what I understand from your responses, you're mentioning that throughout the 1980s and 1990s, there was not much of a concrete Yemen policy toward at least from the Iran's end, and Iran was even much more interested in other areas. And I'm very glad you mentioned the Sudanese affair. My question is that why was it? Was it because of the lack of capacity, or it was because the Iranian tried to have the escalation with the Saudis at the controlled area, at the controlled level, or it was just the atmosphere wasn't suitable? Yemeni's government at the time were much more, effective in countering Iran. Was it a matter of will, or was a matter of power?
It's a combination of factors, but again, remember, geography matters. Here's Yemen is far away from Iran. This is not Iraq. It's not even Lebanon. And the history of relations, proximity, ideologically, otherwise, just doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. Anybody who claims that Yemen and Iran, or even the Zaydis or the Shia of Iran are close, it's really over exaggerating, if you will. And remember, if I remember my history right, for most of the Iran-Iraq war, Yemen was on the side of Saddam Hussein. And by the way, Yemen was on the side of Saddam Hussein even when he invaded Kuwait. So, for Iran, Yemen just wasn't a candidate to join what later on became the Axis of Resistance. It becomes a candidate later on just because it becomes, maybe I'm exaggerating again, but a low-hanging fruit of sorts. You got this group that is in a fight for political domination in that country, and it's at some point, I'm talking about the Houthis here, or what later on became Ansar Allah. They're looking for external supporter, a benefactor, and Iran is there to offer at a low cost, at a low price. Never really do you get a sense by listening to the analysis of Iranian officials that they felt at any point that they can turn these Yemeni Zaydis into what the Hassan Nasrallahs and the Hezbollah of Lebanon were for Iran. Yemen has never even come close to that point. And that shows you, yes, there is a convenience of sorts between the two in the last decade or so, since the Houthis took Sana'a, and there's been Iranian support. I'm not the expert, but I think any layman who looks at what Yemen has, or the Houthis have done in terms of their missile capacity, the precision of some of their attacks recently in Israel, so on, clearly there's been an element of external support. Again, if you had to guess, Iran, and we know Hezbollah figures were in Yemen, we know Revolutionary Guards has been present among the Houthis. So there's been support, definitely, on the military side, but also in terms of Iran for sure has helped trying to shape to the extent possible the image of the Houthis, certainly in the Islamic world. I mean, I remember that the Iranians had a role to play when the Houthis went from being called Shabab al-Mu'minin, the youth, the believing youth, to Ansar Allah, because Shabab al-Mu'minin sounded more sectarian. Maybe there was a Shia element there, or Zaidi element, didn't seem so good from Iran's perspective. So we have evidence that the Iranians tried to sort of push the Houthis in the direction of playing a role in the Arab world of sort of subscribing to the Islamic Republic's worldview of militant Islamism against the likes of the United States and Israel. So they've done some of that for sure. But again, that's not to say that the leadership in Yemen today, the Houthis, are looking to Ali Khamenei to give him a call, to give him a command to do, A, B, or C. I think everyone here on this panel, I'm guessing, would agree with that they are not a proxy of Iran. They are a partner of Iran when the opportunities have presented themselves where they could be a win-win situation, as we've seen in recent years. But again, it's really important to keep those caveats in mind and not assume Ansar Allah is Hezbollah, because that's not the case.
Thank you. So it's not a patron-client; it's more of a June. I'm getting to you, Nadwa. So first, I would like you to make the comment that you want, and the second, once you made the comment, I would like you to give us a little bit of the information about the activities of Al-Qaeda from the 9/11 to the Arab Spring, because it has something to do with the second question that I have. To what extent, Sunni insurgency were activated during that decade specifically? What blocked them, what also fueled their activity in the region. But now, it's yours.
I completely agree with Alex that the Houthis are not like Hezbollah to Iran. Iran created Hezbollah. Hezbollah was completely devoted to Iran, in my opinion. The Houthis are not like that. The relationship between the Houthis and Iran actually goes back to the mid-'80s at least. And back then there was the Believing Youth in Yemen. It's a movement that was created to revive the Zaidi tradition because of the expansion of the Sunni Islam in the north, which is a traditional Zaidi stronghold. But the Houthis are not to be conflated with the Believing Youth. They emerged from the Believing Youth, but they're not the movement. In fact, the leader of the Houthi movement, Hussein al-Houthi, was not even part of the Believing Youth. But he did hijack the movement towards the mid-1990s, and then he militarized it and he radicalized it. The Believing Youth was largely a peaceful organization, cultural, if you will. So in the 1990s, in the 1980s, the father of the Hussein al-Houthi, who's the founder of the Houthi movement, and his father spent some time in Qom and in Lebanon, and they came back with revolutionary ideas, and they came back frustrated with the Believing Youth being largely peaceful. They wanted a more sort of, armed resistance against the government. And so what happened in the late 1990s, they hijacked the movement because of their status in the community. And in the 90s, the Iran support was mainly a religious support. It came from the Iran religious establishment. But towards the end of the decade, the IRGC became involved, and it starts funding and supporting the Houthis. during the 2000s, Hezbollah was mainly in charge of sort of mentoring the Houthis, if you will. And when the Arab Spring happened, I can talk about that a little bit. That's when Iran became more involved in Yemen. The IRGC became even more directly involved in Yemen. When the Arab Spring happened, it created a political turmoil, and that was between 2011 and 2014 when the war erupted. Hundreds of Houthi members and leaders went to Iran and to Lebanon, and they received military and also media training, and they came back and they started expanding militarily in 2011. So it goes back to before 2014 when the Houthis took over the capital, and it goes back to before the Saudis and the Emiratis intervened in Yemen. So here's the thing with Iranian investment in the Houthis, and I think it was very effective. The Iranians, I heard that from a former Houthi, who's a Houthi defector now. He told me that he's been to Lebanon, he's been to Iran, and Iran, when he was in Iran, he was told by the Iranians that the Iranian strategy is to scoop the sea with a spoon. So Iran invested in the Houthis slowly, but consistently and effectively, and that resulted in one success after another to what we see today. The Houthis have become Iran's main sort of ally in the region, and the most effective one, particularly after the fall of the Assad regime and Hezbollah's weakening by Israel.
Thank you. I appreciate it. One quick question, then I will get back to the, after 9/11 questions. So when you say religious help, do you mean a spiritual support or a maneuver by Iranian to assimilate or incorporate the Zaydis more further into the Shia Isna Asharis?
It was more like scholarship. So the Houthis go to Iran and they study in Qom and they go back with ideas, but it was purely spiritual. It was not military or political.
Until the IRGC takes over.
And the IRGC took over, which is around the late 1990s.
Perfect. And then the second question that I do have for you, which brings us to the decade of the war on terror. I'm going to ask, John, about the U.S. aspect of it. But from the Yemen perspective, how the war on terror, from the 9/11 to the beginning of the Arab Spring, changed the perspective of the Yemen, its political dynamic? What was the state of all the radical insurgency groups in Yemen during that decade? Was Ali Abdullah Saleh successful in containing the terror, the threat of the terror? What is your assessment of that decade?
Well, Ali Abdullah Saleh came under a lot of pressure by the U.S. government to deliver, to contain Al-Qaeda. And initially he didn't, but then he did. But Ali Abdullah Saleh was also known to have his dealings with the group. He did take action against Al-Qaeda, but at the same time, he had his dealings with them. He wanted to maintain the threat up to a level where it's still there so that it justifies more support and more funding and sort of more blind eye from the West to his domestic repression. So that was, and I know from my research with local tribes that Ali Abdullah Saleh was reluctant to sort of uproot the threat of Al-Qaeda. In fact, in 2011, when he was forced to step down, there are reports that Ali Abdullah Saleh handed a military base to Al-Qaeda in Abiyan Governorate so that he proves that if he's out of power, Al-Qaeda can come back. And this was a pattern. And so he was not very serious about fighting Al-Qaeda. He had some successes, but they were just enough to prove that he is an ally and he can support the West in the fight against terror.
I have a question, and the question is that Nadwa mentioned the takeover of the IRGC toward the late 90s, And then we have the Arab Spring and the final takeover of the Houthis in Yemen. I have a question for you, and the question is that to what extent, in your view, the Houthis own their victory in 2014 and 15 in the consolidating their power in a notable portion of Yemen to the Iranians? Was it an expected event by the Iranians? Was it in their planning, or it was just a momentum, came out of nowhere and served their interest?
Thanks, Arman. Let me just very quickly say something to what Nadwa said. I'm gonna say that Nadwa made the point that there were Zaidis going to Iran in the mid 1980s, I think she said, which wouldn't surprise me. I don't know exactly who went, but I will look it up. But it wouldn't surprise me, just to keep everybody up to date in terms of what was happening at the time in the 1980s. You had multiple Iranian factions within the Islamic Republic engaged in what they called overseas revolutionary activities. So you had different groups at the time, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to folks who were associated with Revolutionary Guards, engaging in this. And you had even rogue elements. We all know the Iran-Contra affair had nothing to do with Yemen, but that was a reflection of the infighting in the regime at the time. So this business, because I made the point that in the 1980s, Iran was busy with the fight with Iraq's Saddam Hussein, which I think is true. That was where the bulk of Iran's energy went in. But that doesn't mean they didn't do other things. We know, for example, there were cases of smuggling of arms into places like Mecca in Saudi Arabia. If you talk to the Bahrainis, they'll tell you there were Iranian attempts to create unrest among the Shia in that country. So I think it's an important point that to say maybe there were, as Nadwa pointed out, and I'll look it up, some of these Zaidis that went to Iran in the 1980s. My point is, it wasn't a big ticket item in terms of the Islamic Republic's agenda. And by the way, I should also point out, Iran spends significant amounts of money, particularly in recent years, in creating new audiences, particularly in the Islamic world. All sorts of attempts have been done to, bring in Sunni clerics to sort of have more sympathy for Iran's narrative. If you look at the money Iran, for example, spends on things like the Al-Mustafa University, where they bring lots of Arabs and other Muslims from around the world to sort of be receptive to Iranian messaging, that has been going on for sure for many years now. Now, in terms of specifically 2014 and how much Iran is to be, how much of the victory of the Houthis should be attributed to what Iran did, I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. I've never seen any studies that show. I love to hear what Nadwa and John have to say about it. The Iranians, if they were a big player in the outcome on the ground, to my knowledge, they've never bragged about it the way they've done elsewhere. For example, in terms of how pro-Iranian militia in Iraq after 2014 were rolling ISIS back, Iran wouldn't miss an opportunity to advertise that as a sign of Iranian success in the battlefield. Or the 2006 war between Hezbollah and Israel. Again, the Iranians would proudly proclaim to have played a key role. But I haven't seen anything similar to when it comes to what the Houthis were able to do against their internal rivals in the Yemeni theater. That's not to say they didn't play a significant role. I'm sure they played a role, but how significant, I just don't know the answer to that. I would just say, really, for me, when I was watching this about 10 years ago now, it's the UAE and Saudi intervention in the Yemeni civil war that gets Iran's attention. And they, from all the accounts that I've seen, become more involved in Yemen. So while the Yemenis were just fighting it out among themselves, Iran, at least in terms of the narrative, they were not at the heart of this. Changes significantly with the intervention of UAE and Saudi Arabia, because it becomes that tit-for-tat, a reflection of the tit-for-tat rivalry that was happening at the time across the region. We have to remember, post-Arab Spring, Iran and the Gulf states in particular, but also others like Turkey and so on, are all engaged in multiple zero-sum competitions from Libya to Yemen to Syria to Iraq and so on. Iran at the time in 2014-15 is very heavily involved and busy trying to preserve Assad's regime in Damascus. And yet, once the Saudis entered the war in Yemen, the Iranians have to muster enough capacity to see if they can get involved in that war. And that's the thing that, to me, that's the moment. And again, I'd love to hear what Nadwa and John have to say about it. That's how I saw it. That's the moment where Iran enters into the fray, if you will, in ways we hadn't seen before.
I appreciate your response. Let's get back to Nadwa. Nadwa, I have the same questions for you. And one of the reasons that I'm asking this is that some people really claim that or overemphasize or overestimate the Iranian role in that the Houthis will take over. Some people suggest otherwise. I believe it was the Washington Institute makes a report arguing that Iran even wasn't at the beginning in favor of the movement towards Sana'a. So I would like to take your take on those days in 2014, what role Iranian played, to what extent the rule was even effective, and what was the reaction or stance on the somewhat of a blitzkrieg that the Houthis got in 2014.
Yeah, so I mean, the one thing I agree with Alex is that the Iranian support was not the decisive factor behind the Houthis' rise. That I agree. However, I don't think that Iran's support to the Houthis came in reaction to the Saudi/UAE intervention. That's the mainstream narrative, but I think it's deeply flawed. The Iranians started supporting the Houthis after 2011, and the Iranians were very smart. They found vacuum and they exploited opportunities that others have left. Others from Yemeni government, Yemeni parties, to Saudi, UAE, to the West, to even the UN peace process. They've exploited all these vacuums, and they saw potential in the Houthis. This is a group that's extremely young and ambitious and tolerates pain. And so, in my opinion, the Houthis have been a major stroke of luck to the Iranians. Like I said, after the Arab Spring, what happened, how the Houthis rose, was because they took advantage of the weak and divided government that followed the uprising, which forced former President Abdullah Saleh out of power. Back then, Saleh remained influential politically, but also he was in control of most of the armed forces. And so he struck a secret deal with the Houthis. And I've heard also the Iranians were involved. So with his support, they managed to expand militarily from the remote mountains of Sa'ada all the way into Sana'a and beyond Sana'a. And this whole notion that the Iranians were upset that the Houthis took Sana'a, I've heard analysts say that, and I asked one of them and I said, "What's your source?" He said the Iranians told them. Of course, the Iranians would say that. What would the Iranians say? They would say, "No, we were very happy they took Sana'a." So, taking the Iranians as a source for an information like that, when every other indicator shows that they were invested in this and they saw a huge opportunity in it, I think it just shows that some of these analyses are not accurate. But so again, the Houthis took advantage of these divisions within the Yemeni government, and it played into their hands, and that led to them taking the Sana'a, the capital Sana'a, in September 2014. So that's also when the Iranian support skyrocketed. That's not after the Saudis intervened. That's 6 months before the Saudi-led coalition intervened. What happened after the Houthis took Sana'a? The first thing they did, two things. One, they initiated 14 flights a week between Sana'a and Tehran, so twice a week. And these flights brought high-level commanders and advisors, IRGC, Hezbollah, and others from the Axis of Resistance, weapons, and all of that. And again, between 2011 and 2014, hundreds of Houthis and opposition figures went to Lebanon and Iran, where they received training, they were vetted, and they were sent back to Yemen to play a role. Also, very important factors, Hezbollah and IRGC elements have been in Yemen before 2014. One of them is the deputy commander of the Quds Force, Abdul Reza Shahlai, who was sanctioned by the US, he was in Yemen before 2014. And he oversaw training, recruitment, and Houthi military operations. And the context then was that after 2011, the Houthis, with support from Saleh, and also the Iranians, started expanding beyond Sa'ada in the north, and they started taking governorates one after another until they reached Sana'a in 2014. So the other thing that the Houthis did after they took Sana'a is they started conducting military drills on the border with Saudi Arabia. So they signaled that they're some sort of hostility, and that sort of prompted the Saudis to interfere militarily. I'm not saying that the Saudis' intervention in Yemen was positive the way it was done, but if the Saudis did not intervene, Iran would have taken all Yemen. The Houthis would have definitely taken all Yemen, and the situation would have been much worse. So what brought what? I agree. There's an element of competition. There's an element of sort of Iran also is after, especially after the Iraq invasion, Iran felt threatened that before it's Afghanistan and now Iraq, and it's sandwiched. And so it had to look for other ways to sort of protect herself away from its borders, and the Houthis provided that opportunity. And also one thing I want to mention, that Iran started sending weapons to the Houthis before 2014. There was 2 interdictions of 2 ships in Yemen waters, Jihan 1 and Jihan 2, coming from Iran and to the Houthis. And so I think Iranian support to the Houthis is both downplayed and also overestimated. So I think we need to bring some balance to that. And it's easy to just blame the US and US allies in the region for Iran's actions, for the Houthis' actions. There is an element for that. Of course, there's a reaction from these groups from Iran, but at the same time, Iran also has its own agenda. I mean, Iran is committed to exporting the Iranian revolution across the world, not just the region. And the Houthis inherited that passion and that mission. And now they see themselves as a global sort of player who wants to do that. And the past 2 years have added energy to that desire.
Thank you, Nadwa. I appreciate it. I very much appreciate outlining the Iranian having a so-called Yemen bureau on the IRGC vote for, so that is a platform, and the Arab Spring, kind of gave it the momentum. And I'm glad that you mentioned that the Houthis, trying to kind of boost, or let's say that improve their standing. Our director at the Global National Security Institute, General McKenzie, about a year ago, in one of his speeches, in the heat of the after October 7 attacks, one of the main things that he mentioned was that since the October 7th, the Yemenis, the Houthis, with these disruption of the Red Sea, one of the achievements they had, at least at their own end, that they have improved themselves from a local actor now to a regional actor. So it's very good to hear it from you too. But I want to go to the John. John, hopefully you're with us, and now you owe me 2 questions. The first one is still, I want to ask the role of Yemen in the decade of the war of the terror, how the United States saw it, a collaboration with Ali Abdullah Saleh. Nadwa kindly outlined the Saleh's, and how did he see it? He see it as an opportunity for the, security and also expansion of self-power. That's the first question. And the second question that I have for you is about the early days of early years after the Yemenis, the Houthis take over in Sana'a. So we know Iranians were happy. Houthis obviously were happy. Arab states of the Persian Gulf, primarily UAE and Saudi Arabia, were not, and they later on intervened. What was the United States' reaction? What was United States' view on the event? Why the United States didn't take any decisive actions at the very beginning? Because obviously later on they came to the conclusion, I think they always had that conclusion, that Houthis were a threat. But why the Americans didn't take any decisive actions while the Houthis were moving toward the Sana'a? U.S. had a military presence in the region, had a military presence in the Red Sea. what made Americans to, at least at that moment, be a passive observant, if I may say so?
Certainly, and hopefully my technology issues have been sorted out, and apologize for that. And thanks again to Nadwa and Alex for doing a really great job and bailing me out on some of the other questions, in particular with really, really important and critical perspectives and insights. So that was great to hear. So let me go back to answer your first question. The early days, let's say after 9/11 and the global war on terrorism. So I think, as you rightfully asked and pointed out, what the focus was and what the relationship was with the Saleh government was at that time. As I had mentioned at the outset, particularly after 9/11, when there was a global war on terrorism, there was greater interest in working with the Yemenis, if you will, and Saleh and the government and the people there, everything ranging from intelligence and security cooperation to development assistance and humanitarian assistance, the full range of, let's say, typical U.S. government support for a partner, but obviously with the focus and priority being on counterterrorism, particularly against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP, Al-Qaeda and its affiliates globally, and then, of course, as things evolved over the years, ISIS or Daesh and others as well. And then very close to Yemen, of course, Al-Shabaab in Somalia and East Africa. So a lot of focus on that entity as well during that time period. And then within that, at least militarily, in terms of the counterterrorism operations, a lot of drone strikes, a lot of special forces operations, as we know about as well. I think what always made it somewhat chaotic or complicated in terms of the bilateral relationship were obviously the instability in Yemen and humanitarian issues, maybe ebbs and flows in the bilateral relationship with Yemen, particularly over the years, and then obviously with the ousting of Saleh and then the rise of President Hadi, things maybe got a little bit better. Obviously, Hadi was viewed as more, I think, more amenable to U.S. counterterrorism cooperation and operations. Obviously, there were some negative impacts on all the military strikes in Yemen, as there were civilians who suffered a number of casualties as well. And obviously the humanitarian crisis going on at the same time, getting worse as well. I think now if I can transition somewhat to question 2, as it's also related to question number 1, with the Houthi takeover in the Civil War, as I mentioned at the outset, going back to the Cold War era and containing the Soviet Union, the U.S. was always focused on, at least in the Middle East, shoring up its allies, particularly the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, and other partners in the Gulf as well. And so with what was going on at that time with the Houthi takeover in the Civil War, the U.S. suspended and decided to suspend U.S. embassy operations there and reduce personnel, and many people were evacuated. And then obviously with Saudi Arabia being a longstanding partner of the United States, began providing more and more material support to Saudi Arabia, including, logistical intelligence and, weapons to Saudi Arabia against the Houthis, at that time at least perceiving the Houthis as an Iranian proxy. And I think we've heard from my co-panelists that there is some debate as to the extent of the Houthis being proxies of Iran at that particular point in time. But certainly I think the perspective from the U.S. was, at a minimum, Iran could and would benefit from this takeover by the Houthis. Again, at the same time, as we saw in the global war on terror period, particularly the first 10 years, let's say 2001 to 2011, with U.S. military operations causing some civilian casualties there, and a worsening humanitarian crisis, there were a lot of concerns about what else are we doing to support the Yemeni people beyond counterterror cooperation, beyond security cooperation, because many people were in dire need of support in terms of the humanitarian perspective. There were a number of debates in the U.S. Congress about Yemen policy and how to balance between the need for improving security, while at the same time, the need for addressing severe humanitarian crises as well. Certainly, having said all that, when the Houthis did take over, that did cause some disruption to U.S. counterterrorism networks, and it did complicate intelligence sharing. And, as you rightfully asked, what was the U.S. policy at that time when this happened? Because it appeared that things were shifting quite rapidly in the U.S. approach. I think that was due to this kind of ongoing internal debate as to what the policy should be, given what was going on at that particular point in time. And I think looking at how to navigate the situation where we typically have worked with governments, and we were working with the Saleh and Hadi governments prior to the Houthi takeover, who do we then kind of work with at that point in time? Is it possible to do counterterrorism and operations without, let's say, a partner on the ground, and what that meant in the Yemeni context, which then I think in terms of the policy response, given that aspect, I think led to greater U.S. reliance on, in cooperation with Saudi Arabia, and kind of just supporting them in their efforts, and maybe more or less letting them kind of lead the way in that effort in the southern part of the peninsula against the Houthis, which obviously the kingdom saw the Houthi rise, if you will, as a direct challenge to both counterterrorism cooperation with the U.S., its own counterterrorism practices, but then also longstanding Saudi interest on the peninsula itself. And so I think maybe just to kind of sum up kind of where we are, at least at that point in time, I think the U.S. was trying to balance between how does it continue to maintain strong regional alliances while ensuring that its own interests were advanced as well. And so that's why I think there was strong cooperation and support to what the kingdom was doing at that time. And I think also driven largely by the perception that the Houthis were an Iranian proxy. And, we know going obviously back to 1979, ever since, the U.S. and Iran have been at odds, so to speak. And so I think looking at the situation there in that lens, and maybe less so as having the ability to directly be involved. I'll stop there.
I appreciate it, John. Thank you very much. And, I want to go to Alex. Alex, so far, and it's nothing new, but when it comes to the Middle East, there is defining moments. Iranian Revolution was one of them. 9/11 was the other one. Arab Spring was the other one. And then the last one, I think, one of the last ones is the October 7th, which changes the dynamic, the pattern, the nature, everything about the Middle East. Even actors changed. What role the October 7 and aftermath played in Iranian Houthis partnership, and why Houthis, and in Houthis being involved in the day after the October 7? What role do you think Iranian played, and how the Houthis involvement in the crisis itself, even if they make that decision independently from the Iran, how it shaped the axis of resistance interactions with the United States and Israel from the October 8th day,
Obviously, the big headline in terms of impact of October 7th is that the axis of resistance in its totality today is much weaker than it was before. I think we would all agree on that, because what has happened is that the Israelis, backed by the United States, have decided to take the fight out there across the region against their sort of rivals. And we've seen that with Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, essentially, at times being at war or attacking 7 different countries simultaneously. So that is the reality of today. The axis of resistance, by and large, has not been able to stand up to that pressure or fight back in any way that suggests that they're capable of matching the U.S. and Israel kinetically. We've seen the fall of Assad. We've seen what happened to Hezbollah. We've seen the pro-Iranian militants in Iraq more or less quiet, which, has made some conclude the last standing element of the acts of resistance today are the Houthis, because they are still there. You can bomb them, as Israel and U.S. has done, and they're still there. Are they doing this in close coordination with the Iranians? Again, a question mark for me. I've always come to conclude when it comes to the Houthis that it makes a lot of sense for them to play the Palestine card, both in terms of what I understand Yemeni domestic politics to be, and I'm certainly no expert on that, but also how it plays out in terms of elevating the image of the Houthis in the broader Arab and Islamic world. Do the Iranians help propagate that message? I assume so, because it sort of that doesn't go against what they have done in recent years. But another way of looking at it, where were the Houthis during the 12-day war between Iran and Israel? Or for that matter, any of those members of the so-called Axis resistance? So much of this depends on perspective in terms of you see the world based on where you sort of stand. Nadwa earlier was talking about Iran having been involved in the Yemeni theater way before 2014 and 15. I think she pointed out to the 2011 Arab Spring. I'm not disputing that at all. What I'm saying is, what could they have done if they wanted to double down? And were they actually the decisive actor in 2011 in Yemen? Because again, if you're an Iran watcher like I am, year 2011 is when the Iranians are shell-shocked, because Arab Spring surprised them as much as anybody else. They're worried about Arab Spring coming and happening inside of Iranian territory. They had just had the 2009 Green Opposition movement happening, which brought almost the regime down just a couple of years earlier. So then there raises the question for me, what capacity do they have to go out there and export the revolution? I mean, exporting the revolution is something that they're committed to, but much more in words than in actuality, because there's a difference between what Iran says it wants to do, what Iran is capable of doing. And again, this 2011, this is when the Obama administration's sanctions policy started really choking the Iranian economy. So where's the money? Even if you have perfect situation where you got ideological alignment with the Houthis, which they don't have, but let's just say they did, where is the money? So I'm saying there's been support for the Houthis, for sure, because I think that is evident by their military capabilities over the last decade plus, but the extent of which we have to question. And I'm always mindful of all the sort of, the narrative that the Gulf states at the time were putting out there, because they had an agenda to make the Houthis just look like an actor that was paid for by the Iranians, because that obviously brought the US into it. It would become a very black and white, easy to figure out who the good guys are, who the bad guys are. To me, it was never that simple. To me, it was never that straightforward, because again, I'm not an expert on Yemeni domestic politics. The Iranians have had one thing they've done throughout the history since 1979, acting opportunistically when somebody else messes up. And I think it's the same thing. It's true for Hezbollah in Lebanon during the civil war in the 80s. The Shia of that country needed somebody to come and give them a helping hand. They showed up and created Hezbollah. The Iraqis post-2003 U.S. invasion of that country. Something very similar with the Houthis in Yemen. They didn't create the Houthi reality. Did they take advantage of it? Yes. Did that go up and down? I think so. So would the Houthis tomorrow, do anything Iran asked them to do when it comes to whatever might happen to Iran next? That's where I have serious doubts. I really think the Houthis will obviously put their own agenda, domestic agenda, and political survival in that country at the top of their agenda, as opposed to taking any risks on behalf of the Islamic Republic when it might not serve their, domestic agenda and that of political survival.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much. I appreciate pointing out the Houthis' desire. They have their own interest in getting involved in the October 7, and also talking about the spoiler nature of Iran. But Nadwa, I do have a question for you based on that. Is about why the Houthis decided to get involved. as the Alex stated it, they may have been influenced, but that's a decision that they made, and they are carrying it by themselves. Was they chose to get into a fight with Israel in a wrong timing, when the Israeli sense of vengeance was at its peak as after October 7, in a conflict which is very much asymmetric. There is no doubt the capability of Yemen Houthis and the Israelis are not the same, not even close. They still make that decision. My question for you is that why, and what was in it for them? Is it anything in it for them, or is it purely an ideological movement?
Well, the Houthis got involved after October 7th, and they started bombing ships, and they wrap themselves around the Palestinian flag, and they say it's in support of Gaza, but that's actually not true, or not entirely true. The Houthis believe that God is on their side. This is the fight that they've been looking for since 2004, when they started their rebellion against the government. They said that they're at fight with Israel and the West. So this is a dream come true for the Houthis. And this group is hugely driven by their ideology. They're not as pragmatic as people like to paint them. And I can talk about the ideology and the drivers, but before that, what I want to say is that this was an opportunity for the Houthis. And I agree with Alex that Iran saw in the Houthis an opportunity, but the same thing, the Houthis saw in Iran supports an opportunity. The one thing about this relationship is that it's been consistent and effective. Unlike the Yemeni government relationship with the Saudis, it's different. In my opinion, one of the reasons why the Houthis continue to rise is the diversions between the Saudis and the Emiratis, and the fact that they've supported rival forces within Yemen, and that weakened the anti-Houthi bloc, and that contributed to the Houthis' rise. But anyway, let's go back to the Houthis and what they're doing in the Red Sea. So what the Houthis are gaining from bombing ships in the Red Sea, different things. One, domestically, this enabled them to consolidate power within Yemen, because now they're portraying themselves as the defenders of Palestine, and that reinforces their narrative that they're leading a war against Israel and the West, okay? They're holding Israel accountable. So they use that to justify oppression at home. The Houthis are not a group that is interested in governing, they're interested in controlling the population. And so what they do, they impose recruitment, and they continue to systematically indoctrinate children, because in Houthis' vision, what Yemen is a recruitment camp. They want to ensure a steady flow of loyal recruits in the future. And there are other things they do in Yemen, to make sure that happens. Things like dismantling the tribal structure, destroying civil society, extreme repression, etc., etc. But beyond Yemen, October 7 allowed the Houthis to project themselves as a regional actor. It sort of transformed them from a Yemeni insurgency into this transnational leader of the Muslim world, not just Yemenis. And as defenders of Islam and Palestine, they gained a lot of legitimacy in the region, in the Muslim world, but also internationally. We've seen protests in the US chanting for the Houthis, not so much inside Yemen because they're extremely repressive. And so the Houthis, in my opinion, have emerged as the essential player, if not the new leader in Iran's axis of resistance, as an ally, not as Iran's puppet. And that's especially true after Assad's falls and the weakening of Hezbollah. But also, there's one thing that the Houthis are doing now that's not yet making the headlines. The Houthis are forging strategic partnerships in the region. They're expanding into the Horn of Africa. They're now partnering with Al-Shabaab and ISIS in Somalia and AQAP at home in Yemen. They're providing them with weapons, training, drones, and which they use to attack Yemeni forces in Yemen, but also African forces and Somali forces in Somalia. And both groups have helped the Houthis with spotting, with intelligence to target ships in the Red Sea. And I won't go into details about that. But also the Houthis have been recruiting assets from across the Horn of Africa. they also built ties with Russia and China. And there's been reports of China and Russia providing the Houthis with data and satellite images to target ships in the Red Sea. And all of this partnership is to maintain a illicit trade of weapons, oil, and also, movement of operatives across the region, but also to gain legitimacy and economic opportunities and political cover to reduce the impact of Western pressure on the Houthis. So this group is now viewing itself as not only a regional but an international player. The Houthis see themselves as the leader of the Muslim Ummah. And that's where I think I agree. The ideology of Houthis and Iran diverge, because the Houthis are Zaydis, are not Shia 12ers, okay? And if I want to talk about the ideology, and I think it's very important to talk about ideology, it's often dismissed because it's really hard to comprehend. But the Houthis believe that, that they are destined to take Jerusalem. They want Mecca, they want the holy sites in Saudi, and then they want Jerusalem. And that is rooted in Islamic eschatology, the Mahdi. Okay, so this messianic figure that emerged when the time comes, and he leads armies from Yemen, the Levant, and Iraq, and marched towards Jerusalem. Well, before that, he receives oath of allegiance in Mecca, and then he marches towards Jerusalem and destroys, kill the Jews and establish a global Islamic government based in Jerusalem. And I think that's where the Iranians and the Houthis diverge, because they all have the same ideological vision, but at the same time, who is going to be in charge is different, because the ideologues around the Houthis believe that Abdul Malik al-Houthi is that figure. So that explains, this ideology explains why this group is so resilient and why it has such a strong resolve, because they believe that God is on their side and God has gotten them this far. If you think about it, 12 years ago, this group was a small insurgency in the far north mountains of Sada Governorate. And within 10 years, they are challenging the entire world. They've defeated the Saudis, the Emiratis, they've defeated the Americans, they've defeated the Brits, they've defeated now the Israelis. And so, all this failure from the international community to address the Houthis threat, and that's a different question, that's reinforcing this belief system within this group that they are destined for glory and that God will make them win. And so this aspect is very important to comprehend, and it's been absent in most analysis, and I think that should change.
Thank you very much, Nadwa, and you made my job easier because for mentioning the international failure and aspect, so it should change, because it brings us to the last part of this, and the last questions that I'm sure many people are looking forward to. Is we discussed what was the past, what's the current state of affairs briefly as the time allows. But now the question is that what the future beholds us, and specifically speaking, what the United States, the country that we all are in it, should do. Which I want to start with John. John, after October 7, needless to say, the U.S. policy toward the Yemenis from a passive stand quickly changed to an active, and United States has been, on and off making operation, although they had the ceasefires back and forth. But the questions that I do have for you, first, how do you see the future between the Americans, the United States, and the Houthis? The second is, despite how do you see the future, what do you think future should look like? Meaning, what policy you are suggesting the Americans?
Certainly. What a great question. And again, what some great answers and commentary already from Nadwa and Alex beforehand. Really great to be on this panel again. So I'll answer this kind of in two parts. And the first part kind of also goes back to my last response to the last question, because it does impact kind of where we are and where we go from here, just in terms of U.S. policy shifts that seemingly go back and forth from one administration to another. While under the first part of the global war on terror, there was a fair amount of consistency. I would say there has been significant shifts, let's say over the last 10 years or so, particularly when the Houthis first took over, as I mentioned initially, about supporting Saudi Arabia, and then under the first Trump administration, I think escalating that support and even escalating military intervention, and then before the end of that administration, designating the Houthis as a foreign terrorist organization. But there are a lot of concerns about that in our Congress, about what that means for humanitarian access, if you will. And then we saw when the Biden administration came in, there was a reversal of many of those policies, including reversing the designation of the Houthis as a terrorist organization, ending support that we saw prior to that, to the Saudi-led effort, and then also focusing more on the humanitarian issue. But meanwhile, we continue to see the Houthis undertaking a lot of actions, in Yemen, in the region, and against international targets that continue to raise lots of concerns. And so the U.S. still wanted to prioritize maritime security, anti-piracy efforts, and so forth. But then obviously, as we've seen since October 7th, I think kind of where we are right now, as already been stated, the regional escalation has really empowered the Houthis even more. And I think Nadwa gave some really excellent insights in that regard, particularly as they see themselves as leading anti-U.S., anti-Israel efforts, if you will, but then linking their own activities in the Red Sea, as part of the Axis resistance effort, so to speak. And so I think despite efforts to the U.S., over the last couple of years, and we saw escalation of Houthi attacks, in the last couple of years, of course, the Houthis continue to gain regional clout, if you will, despite U.S., U.K., and other allied efforts to counter them. And so I think for Iran, an implication is that the resilience of the Houthis does show that, their proxy strategy, if you will, if we want to call it that, is allowing Tehran to pressure the U.S. and its allies at a relatively low cost, even if there's some discussion as to the extent that they have been a proxy versus Iran just benefits from what they do. But for the U.S., its allies in the West, if you will, and then globally, the region is very strategic. The Red Sea is very strategic, and maritime security, trade, regional alliances, support to Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Israel, etc., Gulf partners, and the potential escalation with Iran, I think will force and require the U.S. to maintain a focus and an eye on what's happening there. So I think kind of going forward, to answer that part of your question, kind of where do we go from here? What are the policy options? I think the U.S. will have to focus even more so on maritime security cooperation and relying a lot on working with its allies and partners in the region in that regard, for global commerce, for energy transit, and so forth. But then also continuing to engage with Oman and others in the region in terms of mediating some kind of peace settlement, if you will, despite how challenging that may be. And we've seen different efforts to do that, maybe not go as far as many would like. But then I think also in terms of using military force, trying to do it in a manner that doesn't necessarily escalate humanitarian costs or civilian casualties, but then really looking at all of this in the lens of how do we just end this conflict, if you will, with the Houthis, if we can, and what are the different options to doing so. And so I think it would take a whole of U.S. government approach to that, not only in the military realm, but also in the non-military realm. So using the State Department in terms of diplomatic efforts, but then looking at the State Department as well as perhaps international organizations or allies and partners in terms of that humanitarian civilian aspects of what may need to be done. But also understanding that Iran does play a heavy role in the region with its own efforts to influence actors, not only in Yemen, but across the region as well. We've already talked about Syria and Lebanon, and let alone Iraq as well. So I think the lens of the U.S. will still be looking at it in terms of capturing Iran as well. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I very much appreciate it. And Alex, to you, I have the same question, but from a bit of different angle. How do you see the future of the Iranian Houthis relationship, given to all that happened so far? And what policy you think United States should approach when it comes to the Iranians' relationship with the Houthis and leveraging that relationship against the United States?
So Arman, there are two parts. Obviously, the first one, I don't know where the regime will go into Iran in terms of the commitment to preserving or even rebuilding so much of the axis of resistance that's been damaged. That remains to be seen. Again, it's a question of politically which way they want to go. I can tell you, as you know well, that in Iran, huge opposition to what the country's people like Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and the Revolutionary Guards are doing in the region, because it's seen, I would say, by vast majority of Iranians, probably a good part of the regime, as not a good investment, because the return is actually not that great. Yes, Iran can, through the Houthis and so on, act like a spoiler, but the basic fundamental challenge for the Islamic Republic is survival of the regime, making sure it doesn't get toppled by its own angry population that finds what the regime is doing in the region to come at their expense. Money that doesn't exist or is little of is being used in these sort of, proxy support for proxy groups. So that's the outcome of that I can't predict. But I think that there's never been a moment where the regime is so under pressure to justify what it's doing with some of these alliances like the Houthis, Hezbollah, and so on. So Iran has to make a decision. The nation state, the national interest, fixing the economy, reducing the costly impact of its foreign policy choices, and focusing, as I said, on what average Iranians want. Because a lot of people are calling for that, including people like former President Hassan Rouhani, former Foreign Minister Javad Zarif. A lot of people are saying that openly. I'm not saying that. So who knows? But that's a choice they have to make. In terms of the United States, look, I don't want to sound very cynical, but I can't help it. There is no American policy for the broader Middle East today. We saw that with the ceasefire between the Americans and the Houthis. When the cost goes up, the United States look for a way out. And that makes sense, but that also shows you that there is no strategy in terms of what the U.S. wants to see in the region. I think that's what the countries in the region, including allies of the United States, increasingly believe, that the U.S. really, oftentimes, as we saw with the attack on Doha by Israel, U.S. even gives the sort of files or subcontracts out to Israel, which isn't necessarily the same as pleasing countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, and so on. So, if you are United States, the first thing you should try and do is to the extent you can, weaken that Iranian or Houthi narrative when they're trying to appeal to the masses in the region, or even the governments, as impossible as that sounds. What do you do? Well, for example, you need to, if you are Washington, do something very different you're doing with the Palestinian issue. We've seen how the Palestine issue and the U.S. support for Israel has turned so much of the public opinion in the region, the global South, against the United States. So you want to undo that. You want to reverse that, because by doing so, you weaken the message of the likes of Islamic Republic of Iran and the Houthis and all these other extremist groups and militants that are saying, diplomacy is not going to result in anything. The Americans are not acting in good faith. The only way you're going to get a good deal for the Palestinians, for Muslims in general, is to fight it out and push these people, these countries out of the region. That's, from American point of view, that's a terrible place to be. You want to, as I said, you want to challenge that narrative. You've got to look for ways to do that. The Palestine issue, to me, in a different American approach to that question, could go a long way helping that. So you got to have the political desire to sit down and think hard about a new strategy, if you will, or you can just simply say, you know what, this is the Middle East. This is what we've always known. There's nothing we can do, and turn your attention elsewhere, which could easily be what the United States, certainly under the Trump administration, ends up opting for.
Thank you, Alex. Well said. I appreciate that. Nadwa, to you, the same questions, but the different angle that I want to ask is that, what do you see the future of the standing of the Houthis in Yemen? And what should be the United States policies toward it? Acceptance, pursuit of change. What is your suggestions?
Yeah, so the future of the Houthis, it depends on how others deal with the threat. So if they continue to deal with it as they do now, containment, reaction, then the Houthis are going to grow into even a bigger threat. And I mentioned before that they're already expanding into the Horn of Africa. They're planting assets. They're actually training Saudi opposition militarily in Yemen. And they're sort of strengthening this wide illicit trade network across the region with the help of the IRGC. So that's an incentive by itself to continue in the course they're already in. So look, I mean, we've tried diplomacy for 10 years. I was one of the people who have advocated for diplomacy, but then the Houthis are not interested in diplomacy. They need an incentive to accept diplomacy. They need an incentive to accept a political settlement. And that incentive is going to be for the Houthis to realize that their best alternative is to come to the negotiation table in good faith or risk lose everything. The Houthis, as long as they have access to the sea, as long as they continue to have power within Yemen, they're not going to back down. They continue to double down on what they're already doing. They don't really care about public perception because they use repression as a main tool to govern, rather than gaining hearts and minds. And so what the U.S. should be doing, and if the U.S. choose not to do now, it will have to do that in the future under much worse circumstances. If no intervention happen, the Houthis will take all Yemen. They can take all Yemen. They're capable of taking all Yemen. And if they take all Yemen, we have a country with 2,000 kilometers of coastline. And now with Al-Shabaab in Somalia, you have 3,500 kilometers of coastline, and all this illicit trade and sort of collaboration between these terrorist groups to not only disrupt international shipping, but also to target Western and U.S. interests and Western allies in the region. So we will see more instability. And so what the U.S. should do is work with the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Yemeni government to dislodge the Houthis, to weaken the Houthis militarily. At the minimum, they need to lose the ports and they need to lose a few governorates. And the Yemeni government forces need to be supported militarily in the form of weapons, intelligence sharing, and training to be able to stop the Houthis from expanding. When the Houthis lose on the ground and they realize that they don't have a choice but to accept a political solution, they're much more likely to agree to a political settlement, and then that will end the war. But nothing else will even mitigate this threat. And I'm afraid that we're losing time, as we've seen since 2014, at least. The Houthis continue to evolve. They've evolved beyond North Yemen. They staged cross-border attacks against Saudi Arabia, which forced the Saudis to end their active involvement in Yemen, active military involvement. And now they're expanding into the Horn of Africa, and God knows what they're going to do tomorrow. And if they take Yemen, we don't have an ally in Yemen. Right now, we have an ally. We have a Yemeni government, as weak as it is, as corrupt as it is an ally. And it is a government that abides by international rules, unlike the Houthis. And so that's what I believe is the solution. Whether it's popular or not is a different story. And if we don't act now, I guess we'll find out in a couple of years. So, yeah.
Thank you. So first pressure and then probably pursuit. Thank you all. Thank you all of, all three of you. It was very kind of you to be here. You spent a great deal of time. You shared a great deal of valuable insights, and for that we are grateful. And also I wanted to thank our audience, as always, for being with us so far, for watching this video. This was our last panel. This is the last panel of country panel that we will have, but it was not the end of the Axis of Resistance initiative. We will get back to you in October with our finale, which would be a conversation between Gerald McKenzie and I. That would be the concluding remark. We will discuss what the future beholds for the Axis of Resistance initiative and the U.S. strategy in tackling that. But for now, I want to thank you once again for being with us. I appreciate your patience and asking you to keep tuning in for our last and final episode. Thank you very much.